The first thing you notice is the smell. Not gunpowder, not pine sap or fresh-cut timber. Swamp, rotting mud under a sheet of ice, and waste that nobody can carry outside because outside means death. And underneath all of it, something sweet, something cloying, a smell you can't name until someone tells you what it is. After that, you never forget it. December 1609, Fort James, Virginia. A triangle of sharpened logs driven into the marshy bank of the James River. Inside, around 500 people. Outside, the forest. And in that forest, a silence that is worse than any sound. To understand how it got this bad, you have to go back to the beginning. In 1607, 3 ships left England, 104 people on board. Merchants, adventurers, a few gentlemen who had never held a shovel in their lives, and a handful of men who actually knew how to work. The Virginia Company promised investors gold. The colonists were promised land and a new life. Nobody said out loud what everyone suspected. A lot of you are not coming back. They arrived in May 1607 and built James Fort. The site was chosen for military reasons, deep enough water for ships, an island that was easy to defend. Nobody asked, is there clean water here? Is the ground good for crops? Is this land a swamp? The answer to all of those questions was no. 8 months later, 38 of those 104 people were still alive. This was not yet the starving time. This was just the beginning. Disease, contaminated water, dysentery, scurvy, conflicts with the local tribes. Nearly 2/3 of the colonists died before they had time to properly understand what they had walked into. When the first resupply ship arrived, the survivors nearly abandoned everything and sailed home. The only reason they didn't is that the ship reached shore before they could get out. For the next 2 years, Jamestown survived by a thread, held together largely by one man, Captain John Smith. He was the only person in the colony who had a working relationship with Powhatan, the paramount chief whose confederation of tribes controlled the land surrounding the fort. Smith knew how to negotiate. He knew how to make men work. He had a talent for not dying in places where everyone else was dying. In August 1609, there was an accident. A bag of gunpowder ignited at his waist. The burns covered most of his body. Smith understood that without serious medical treatment he would not survive, and in October 1609, he sailed back to England. He never returned to Jamestown. Powhatan learned about Smith's departure immediately. He had better intelligence than the colony did. He knew everything. Within days of Smith's ship leaving, the tribes stopped trading with the settlers. They didn't attack, they just stopped trading. A colony that cannot trade with the local tribes cannot survive. That is not an exaggeration, it is a fact. The drought of 1609 had destroyed the harvest. Fishing was poor. Hunting had become life-threatening. The only reliable source of food was trade with the surrounding tribes, and now it was gone. The acting president, Captain John Ratcliffe, decided to restore trade by force. It was the last decision he ever made. November 1609. Ratcliffe receives an invitation from Powhatan. Come to us, bring your goods, and we will give you corn. Everything will be fair. Bring your men. Ratcliffe brought 25 men and walked straight into an ambush. Most of the colonists were killed on the spot. Ratcliffe was taken alive. That was not by accident. Powhatan wanted survivors who could carry the story back to the fort. Ratcliffe was stripped naked and tied to a tree facing a fire. Women of the tribe scraped the living flesh from his bones using mussel shells and threw the pieces into the flames in front of his eyes. He watched all of it. An eyewitness, Captain William Fettipless, described what he saw in detail. It was recorded by George Percy, the man who, at that point, was the last person left with any authority in Jamestown. History remembers Ratcliffe as the luckless captain. That description carries the whole weight of the age in 2 words. After that, Powhatan sent a message back to the fort. Not in words. The next men sent out to negotiate were found at the gates with their mouths stuffed with dry grass. That was the answer to any question about a truce. December 1609. The fort, a triangle of logs roughly 300 feet on each side, was sealed from the inside. Powhatan did not storm it. He didn't need to. The fort sat on a swamp, and the swamp was already killing the people inside it faster than any war party could. The strategy was simple: cut off everything outside and wait. Hunters were killed. Anyone going out for firewood was killed. Anyone trying to fish at the bank was killed. The forest stood quiet but alive. Someone was always out there. That cracking of dry branches. Always. Nobody knew if it was wind or a person. Nobody went out to check. Inside the fort, 500 people conserved everything they had. They barely spoke. They barely moved. George Percy, the only person who left a detailed account of that winter, wrote that the colonists felt what he called the sharp prick of hunger, which no man can truly describe but he who has tasted the bitterness of it. Because the siege made it impossible to take waste outside, it built up inside the walls. The swamp beneath them was already poisonous. At high tide, salt water from the bay pushed up the James River and mixed with the fresh water. The settlers drank a brackish, murky liquid that dehydrated them instead of relieving their thirst. Kidneys failed. Intestinal infections came in waves. But the main killer was starvation. The 7 horses brought over by the summer fleet were eaten first. That took a few weeks. Then the dogs. Then the cats. The colonists recorded it all methodically, in diaries, in reports, in letters written in the hope that someday they might actually be sent. Percy wrote later, "We were glad to make shift with vermin, as dogs, cats, rats, and mice. Rat meat is tough and bitter, but it is protein. In December of 1609, a man could kill over a rat. When the rodents ran out, they moved on to leather. A boot takes several hours to boil. You have to cook it longer than any meat before it softens enough to chew. The smell is pine tar and woodworking glue. The taste is bitter starch that coats your teeth. The nutritional value is almost nothing, but it created the feeling of having eaten something. In those conditions, that feeling mattered. They boiled belts, collars, and book bindings. When the leather ran out, they ate laundry starch, the paste gentlemen used to stiffen their collars in better days. The archaeological record confirms it. The starch stores were consumed. Firewood was its own crisis. The forest was 100 yards away, but stepping outside meant dying. The solution was simple and brutal. They dismantled the houses of their dead neighbors. First the outer boards, then the roof beams. By the middle of winter, half the structures inside the fort were bare frames, and the living sat next to the literal skeletons of the people who had lived next door. Starvation changes a body slowly. That is part of what makes it so terrifying. You don't notice it happening until you do, and by then it's too late. Scurvy starts quietly, weakness, fatigue, then the teeth. When the body runs out of vitamin C, it stops producing collagen, the protein that holds connective tissue together. The gums soften. Touch a tooth with your tongue and it moves. A day later, it falls out. But the worst part is this. Collagen also holds together old scar tissue. When it breaks down, old wounds reopen. A sword cut, a rope burn, a childhood injury from 10 years ago, it splits back open. Your body comes apart at the seams. Then the legs swell. Starvation disrupts protein levels in the blood, and fluid begins pooling in the tissues. The shins balloon. The skin stretches tight and shiny. Then it cracks. Walking becomes a shuffle. Then it becomes impossible. In the final stages of starvation, the brain begins shutting down everything it doesn't need to survive the next hour. Long-term thinking goes first. Abstract values, honor, duty, faith become just words. What remains is a single question: what can I eat right now? Hallucinations. Men saw ships on the river where there were none. They heard the voices of relatives back in England. One man, by multiple accounts, spent hours holding a conversation with someone who had died a month before and was completely convinced the conversation was real. Sometimes. There are almost any number of times in so long alone being sufficiently 30 miles downriver from Jamestown, at the mouth of the James, stood a second English outpost, Fort Algernon, commanded by Captain James Davis. 30 men. Of those 30, not one died that winter. Not a single one. Now, here is something that almost never appears in the history books, and it changes the picture. 30 miles downriver from Jamestown, at the mouth of the James, stood a second English outpost, Fort Algernon, commanded by Captain James Davis. 30 men. Of those 30, not one died that winter. Not a single one. When George Percy finally made it to Fort Algernon in May of 1610, he found that Davis's men were so well fed, they were throwing crab meat to the hogs, table scraps for animals. While Jamestown was boiling boot leather to survive 30 miles away, crabs were going to the pigs. Percy was furious. He wrote that what at Algernon was fit only for hogs would have been a great relief unto us and saved many of our lives. Why didn't Davis report his supplies? Why didn't he send help? History doesn't give us a clean answer. But that fact is worth sitting with when we talk about the inevitability of what happened at Jamestown. This was not a natural disaster. It was a failure of leadership, logistics, and basic human decency. One more thing that doesn't make the textbooks. Among the 8 ships that made it to Jamestown in the summer of 1609, there was one called the Swallow. It carried grain, enough grain to make a serious difference in what was coming. At some point that autumn, the crew of the Swallow made a decision. They took the grain, all of it, grain intended for the colony, and sailed home to England. They ate it on the way. When news of Jamestown finally reached London, the crew of the Swallow was already there. Something Yahoo, Gah. They were the ones who first told the Spanish ambassador what was happening in Virginia. They told the story in taverns. Possibly with some pride, they had gotten out in time. They were never tried, never punished. The Virginia Company preferred to bury the episode. That, too, is part of the history. Even as people were dying by the dozen every week, the laws held. George Percy, the acting president, imposed emergency rule. Anyone caught stealing food from the common stores was executed. Not flogged, not imprisoned, executed. One man was chained to a tree inside the fort for stealing a handful of corn and left to die. He took several days. Everyone saw it, everyone kept living around it. Later, when Governor Sir Thomas Gates arrived with his divine moral and martial laws, the rules became even harder. Second offense of blasphemy, a needle through the tongue, deserting the colony, death, stealing weapons or gunpowder, death. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a system designed to hold 500 starving people in one place when every instinct they had was screaming at them to scatter. Maybe it worked. Maybe that is why 60 of them were still alive in May. Overall, but the order of dying was rigid. Servants and laborers went first. They had no personal reserves. Then craftsmen. Gentlemen lasted longer. They might have a few pounds of dried peas hidden in their baggage, or a ring that could be traded for something to eat. Some of them died in their silk stockings, still refusing to pick up a shovel. Digging was beneath their station. Their station did not keep them warm. Now we come to the part of this story that history spent 400 years avoiding. In the 17th century itself, accounts of what happened in Jamestown that winter horrified everyone who heard them. The Spanish ambassador wrote to his king after speaking with runaway colonists. They eat the dead, and when an Indian is killed, they dig him up 2 days later to eat him. This was not rumor, it was an official diplomatic dispatch. Percy himself recorded, "Some have digged up dead corpses out of graves and eaten them, and some have licked up the blood which had fallen from their weak fellows." The story of a man who killed and ate his wife circulated from the summer of 1610. It was denied at first, then confirmed by multiple independent accounts. He had killed her, salted the body, and eaten it gradually. When it was discovered, he was hanged, not for murder, for killing her when it could not be proven she had died on her own. That was the logic of a man pushed to a point beyond any moral framework he had ever been given. Then, in 2012, the ground gave up its evidence. Archaeologists from the Jamestown Rediscovery Project found remains in a trash pit inside the fort. A 14-year-old girl. They named her Jane. We will never know her real name. Douglas Owsley of the Smithsonian Institution conducted a detailed forensic analysis. The results were unambiguous. 4 shallow chop marks on her forehead, the marks of first, hesitant attempts. Then the body was turned over. 4 strikes to the back of the skull, one of which split it in half. Then a penetrating wound at the left temple, a blade used as a lever to pry open the skull and remove the brain. Owsley said, "The intent was clear, to remove the brain and cut the flesh from the face for consumption. The brain was likely eaten first because it decomposes fastest." There is no evidence of murder. Owsley believes she died on her own, of starvation or disease. And after her death, hungry people did what their survival instinct demanded of them, crossing every line they had left. Who was she to the person who did this? A stranger? A neighbor? There is no answer, and that not knowing is worse than any answer could be. While Jamestown was dying, the survivors of the sea venture were living on Bermuda. Living is not quite the right word. Surviving, but surviving well. Bermuda had sea turtles, birds, and feral hogs left by Spanish sailors decades earlier. Fresh water, warm weather, no hostile tribes. While Jamestown came apart, 150 people on that island spent 9 months building 2 new ships from Bermuda cedar and wreckage from the flagship. Their story so stunned people back in England that William Strachey, the secretary of the new colonial administration, who had survived the wreck, wrote a detailed account of it. Most historians believe that account was one of the sources Shakespeare used when he wrote The Tempest, a play about a shipwreck and survival on an island. The Tempest was performed in 1611, the year after the survivors made it back to London. 9 months on the island, then 2 handmade ships, Patience and Deliverance, set sail for Virginia. They arrived on May 23, 1610. They expected to find a thriving colony. The gates of the fort were hanging from a single hinge. Sections of the palisade had been torn down for firewood. Empty houses stood open to the sky. No roofs, no floors, no doors. Of the 500 people who had been inside the fort in October, they found 60. Not 200, not 100, 60. Percy described that winter's end as the conclusion of something like a nightmare. Continuous, unrelenting, each day worse than the one before. There were never Englishmen, he wrote, left in a foreign country in such misery. A plain sentence, an accurate one. The survivors looked like something the arriving men struggled to recognize as people. Some could not stand, some could not speak, some just stared at the ships without moving, because hallucinations had been such a constant part of that winter that ships on the river seemed like another one. Governor Gates made the call immediately: evacuate. He had only a few weeks of supplies and no reason to believe the situation would improve. On June 7, 1610, the colonists loaded onto ships and sailed downriver. Powhatan had won. About a day downriver, they met 3 ships coming the other way. On board, Thomas West, Baron Delaware, the newly appointed governor of Virginia. With him, a full year's worth of supplies. Delaware ordered the colonists to turn around and go back. Some of them wept, not from relief, from rage. They had already pictured England, were already home in their minds, and now they were being turned around and sent back to the swamp where 4 out of every 5 of their neighbors had just died. They went back, some in fury, some in despair, some because an order is an order. Jamestown survived, technically. Among the men who had arrived from Bermuda was a young businessman named John Rolfe. His wife and infant daughter had died during the hurricane before they ever reached Bermuda. Rolfe arrived in Virginia a widower, carrying seeds for a particular strain of tobacco in his pocket. A few years later, he would marry Pocahontas, the daughter of Powhatan himself, and he would begin the first commercially successful tobacco cultivation in the history of North America. It was tobacco, not gold, that made Virginia profitable. Tobacco, not heroism, that saved the colony. And it was enslaved labor beginning in 1619 that made the tobacco fields work. Powhatan was never defeated in battle. The war ended not with an English military victory, it ended with the marriage of Rolfe and Pocahontas in 1614. A political alliance, a peace bought through a personal relationship, not through guns. Pocahontas died in England in 1617. She was around 21 years old. Powhatan outlived her by a single year. The swamp at the mouth of the James River is still there. The triangle of the fort disappeared underground centuries ago, but archaeologists continue to dig it out. There is still a great deal left to find. Every few years, a new discovery adds another detail to this picture. The trash pit where Jane was found in 2012 had been buried for 400 years. 400 years, that story waited to be told properly. The land is still there. America started here, not with a parade, not with a speech, with 60 people standing at a broken gate watching ships come upriver, not sure if what they were seeing was real. Your history books gave that winter one paragraph. Now you know what was in that paragraph.